Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality. Among Men by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Quotes. Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men by Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a philosophical exploration of the development of human inequality, tracing it from a natural state to the complex social hierarchies that characterize civilization. Rousseau argues that in the state of nature, human beings were equal, content, and free, but that the establishment of property, laws, and social institutions led to artificial inequalities and the rise of power imbalances. By examining the origins of moral and political inequality, Rousseau presents a critical view of modern society and its discontents, challenging the reader to reflect on the costs of progress and civilization. Quote 1. However important it may be in order to form a proper judgment of the natural state of man, to consider him from his origin, and to examine him, as it were, in the first embryo of the species, I shall not attempt to trace his organization through its successive approaches to perfection. Rousseau begins by emphasizing the importance of understanding man in his natural state, at his origin. However, he deliberately chooses not to speculate on how man's physical body evolved from its original form to its current state. He considers any such attempt to be speculative, as there is insufficient evidence to support a clear evolutionary pathway of man's physical development. Instead, he will assume that man's form has always been as we see it today, and focus on understanding man as he emerges from the hands of nature, without the supernatural or gradual acquisition of artificial faculties. Quote 2. If I strip this being, thus constituted, of all the supernatural gifts which he may have received, and of all the artificial faculties which we could not have acquired but by slow degrees, if I consider him, in a word, such as he must have issued from the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some and less active than others, but, upon the whole, the most advantageously organized of any. Rousseau imagines man in his original natural state, without supernatural abilities or the artificial faculties that come with societal development. He portrays man as physically weaker and less agile than some other animals, but nevertheless, the most advantageously organized due to his ability to survive by using the strengths of all other species. Despite being inferior in physical power, man's adaptability and ability to appropriate the instincts of other animals make him superior in the natural world. Quote 3. Men, dispersed among them, observe and imitate their industry, and thus rise to the instinct of beasts, with this advantage that, whereas every species of beasts is confined to one peculiar instinct, man, who perhaps has not any that particularly belongs to him, appropriates to himself those of all other animals. In this passage, Rousseau explains that early humans, living among animals, observed and imitated the instincts and behaviors of the animals around them. While animals are limited to one specific instinct, man, lacking any particular instinct of his own, is able to adopt and use the instincts of different species. This versatility allows man to survive and thrive by utilizing multiple strategies for sustenance and survival, which is an advantage over animals confined to a single way of life. Quote 4. Nature treats them exactly in the same manner that Sparta treated the children of her citizens. Those who come well-formed into the world, she renders strong and robust, and destroys all the rest. Here, Rousseau draws a comparison between nature's treatment of early humans and the strict practices of ancient Sparta, where only the strong and healthy children were allowed to survive. He suggests that in the natural world, only those humans born with strong constitutions survive and thrive, while the weak perish. This natural selection process contributes to the development of a robust and resilient human species, much like the Spartan method of raising only the strongest citizens. Quote 5. The body being the only instrument that savage man is acquainted with, he employs it to different uses, of which ours, for want of practice, are incapable. Rousseau describes how early man, without tools or technology, relied solely on his physical body for survival. His body was the only tool available, and through constant use and necessity, he developed abilities and strengths that modern man, with his reliance on tools and technology, has lost. This physical adaptation to the natural environment made the savage man highly skilled in tasks that modern, civilized humans would struggle to accomplish without their machines and devices. Quote 6. Let us therefore beware of confounding savage man with the men, whom we daily see and converse with. Rousseau warns that we should not confuse or compare the savage man in his natural state with modern man. The savage man, untouched by society and civilization, is fundamentally different from the people we interact with in daily life. Civilization, with its comforts and structures, has drastically changed the nature of humanity, making it impossible to accurately compare modern humans with their natural ancestors. This distinction is crucial in understanding the true nature of man, as Rousseau discusses. Quote 7. It could not but be a very difficult task to get rid of so diffuse and embarrassing a nomenclature, as in order to marshal the several beings under common and generic denominations, it was necessary to be first acquainted with their properties and their differences, to be stocked with observations and definitions, that is to say, to understand natural history and metaphysics, advantages which the men of these times could not have enjoyed. Rousseau describes the challenges early humans faced in developing a coherent language. Initially, humans likely assigned unique names to every individual object they encountered, which created a vast and confusing vocabulary. This task became increasingly complicated, as people had no understanding of how to categorize objects based on shared characteristics. Rousseau argues that without knowledge of natural history or metaphysical concepts, early humans lacked the tools necessary to organize their language into generic categories, which would have made communication much simpler and more efficient. Quote 8. Every general idea is purely intellectual. Let the imagination tamper ever so little with it. It immediately becomes a particular idea. Rousseau explains the difficulty of forming general ideas, which are abstract and purely intellectual. He argues that once the imagination tries to grasp a general concept, it inevitably converts it into a particular instance. For example, when imagining a tree in general, the mind cannot help but think of a specific tree, either large or small, of a certain color, or with specific features. Thus, Rousseau underscores the inherent challenge of dealing with general concepts, because the human mind tends to turn them into concrete, particular ideas. Quote 9. For the moment, the imagination stops. The mind must stop too, if not assisted by speech. Here, Rousseau asserts that imagination plays a key role in allowing the mind to function, particularly when it comes to forming ideas. However, when the imagination reaches its limits, human thought also ceases unless language comes to the rescue. Speech, therefore, becomes essential in extending the capacity of thought, as it allows the mind to go beyond what the imagination can visualize, making abstract reasoning and complex ideas possible. Quote 10. Which was the most necessary, society already formed to invent languages, or languages already invented to form society? Rousseau presents a philosophical dilemma: whether society existed first and led to the invention of languages, or whether languages had to exist first in order to form a society. This chicken and egg problem highlights the deep interconnection between communication and social structures. Rousseau acknowledges that both society and language seem dependent on each other, but the difficulty lies in determining which came first in human development. Quote 11. But be the case of these origins ever so mysterious, we may at least infer from the little care which nature has taken to bring men together by mutual wants, and make the use of speech easy to them, how little she has done towards making them sociable. Rousseau argues that nature did not design humans to be naturally sociable or to make speech an easy tool for communication. Instead, he suggests that humans were initially solitary and independent, with little need for mutual assistance. This further supports his broader point that society and communication evolved gradually and through necessity, not because humans were naturally inclined to come together and speak with one another. Quote 12. He had in his instinct alone everything requisite to live in a state of nature. In his cultivated reason, he has barely what is necessary to live in a state of society. Rousseau distinguishes between natural instinct and reason. In his view, man's natural instinct was perfectly sufficient for survival in the wild, where the individual had all they needed to live. However, in society, reason is necessary, but it only provides what is minimally required for living in a complex social structure. This suggests that the development of reason may have been driven by the demands of society rather than by the natural needs of man. Quote 13. The first man, who, after enclosing a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. Rousseau argues that the notion of property marked the beginning of civil society. He believes that the first person to claim ownership of land created inequality, leading to countless social ills such as crime, violence, and oppression. He suggests that if people had rejected this claim and recognized that the earth and its fruits belong equally to all, humanity could have avoided many of its historical misfortunes. This concept of ownership transformed the way humans interacted with each other, laying the foundation for social hierarchies, conflict, and power struggles. Quote 14. Such was the condition of infant man. Such was the life of an animal confined at first to pure sensations, and so far from harboring any thought of forcing her gifts from nature, that he scarcely availed himself of those which she offered to him of her own accord. In this passage, Rousseau describes the early state of humanity as simple and instinctive. Humans, like animals, were guided purely by their immediate sensations and needs. They lived in harmony with nature, taking only what was freely available and provided without any notion of controlling or exploiting natural resources. This portrayal of early man is one of innocence and a lack of foresight, where survival depended solely on what nature offered. Quote 15. The first developments of the heart were the effects of a new situation, which united husbands and wives, parents and children, under one roof. The habit of living together gave birth to the sweetest sentiments the human species is acquainted with, conjugal and paternal love. Rousseau explains that as humans began to live together in family units, they developed deeper emotional bonds, such as conjugal and paternal love. This shift from a solitary to a more communal existence brought about the first emotional ties that connected individuals, creating the foundation for more complex social structures. These bonds also marked the beginning of a separation of roles between the sexes, as men became responsible for providing sustenance and women for nurturing the family. Quote 16. Behold then all our faculties developed, our memory and imagination at work, self-love interested, reason rendered active, and the mind almost arrived at the utmost bounds of that perfection it is capable of. Rousseau observes that once human faculties such as memory, imagination, and reason were fully developed, they drove individuals toward personal improvement and social competition. These developments in human nature led to self-love and ambition, which pushed society towards inequality. Humans no longer lived in a state of nature, but were now concerned with status, recognition, and power. The drive for perfection, however, led to moral decay and the emergence of vice, deception, and inequality. Quote 17. In a word, sometimes nothing was to be seen but a contention of endeavors on the one hand and an opposition of interests on the other, while a secret desire of thriving at the expense of others constantly prevailed. Rousseau highlights the negative consequences of inequality that arose with the establishment of property and social hierarchies. As individuals began to compete for resources, status, and wealth, society became dominated by selfishness and ambition. The desire to gain advantage over others led to conflicts of interest, deception, and manipulation, as people sought to advance their own fortunes at the expense of their fellow humans. This atmosphere of competition and greed undermined the original simplicity and equality of human relations. Quote 18. Men were continually repairing, whereas, to erect a good edifice, they should have begun as Lycurgus did at Sparta, by clearing the area and removing the old materials. Rousseau reflects on the flawed development of political institutions, stating that early governments were built on imperfect foundations, and society tried to patch these problems as they arose instead of starting anew. He praises Lycurgus of Sparta for restructuring society from the ground up, contrasting it with other societies where patchwork solutions led to a continuous cycle of problems. Rousseau suggests that a true reformation requires a complete overhaul rather than superficial fixes to pre-existing institutions, as merely repairing an already flawed system leads to ongoing complications. Quote 19. It is therefore past dispute, and indeed a fundamental maxim of political law, that people gave themselves chiefs to defend their liberty, and not be enslaved by them. In this passage, Rousseau asserts that the original purpose of appointing leaders in a society was to protect the people's freedom, not to subject them to tyranny. He argues that the social contract was intended to ensure that leaders serve the interests of their constituents, safeguarding their lives, liberty, and property. This principle counters the idea that individuals willingly submitted to absolute rulers without any safeguards for their own rights, emphasizing that the purpose of government was always meant to be the protection of freedom, not its destruction. Quote 20. As an unbroken courser erects his mane, paws the ground, and rages at the bare sight of the bit, while a trained horse patiently suffers both whip and spur, just so the barbarian will never reach his neck to the yoke which civilized man carries without murmuring, but prefers the most stormy liberty to a calm subjection. Rousseau uses this metaphor to illustrate the stark contrast between free individuals and those who have become accustomed to living under tyranny. He compares free people, who fiercely resist any attempt to impose control on them, to untamed horses who resist the bit, while those who have lived under despotism have become docile, like domesticated animals accepting the whip. He emphasizes that freedom is natural and valued by those who have experienced it, whereas those long accustomed to subjugation lose the ability to appreciate its worth, preferring the security of oppression over the challenges of liberty. Quote 21. The various forms of government owe their origin to the various degrees of inequality between the members, at the time they first coalesced into a political body. Rousseau explains that the formation of different types of government, monarchies, aristocracies, and democracies, was determined by the varying levels of inequality among individuals when they first came together to form a political entity. Those with greater power, virtue, or wealth naturally took leadership roles, shaping the type of government that emerged. As inequality grew, so did the complexity of these systems. Rousseau implies that the fundamental inequality among men played a decisive role in shaping the political structures that governed them, with wealth and power increasingly determining social and political hierarchies. Quote 22. This is the last term of inequality, the extreme point which closes the circle and meets that from which we set out. 'Tis here that all private men return to their primitive equality, because they are no longer of any account. In this statement, Rousseau describes the ultimate consequence of inequality as a return to a new form of equality, but not the original equality of the state of nature. In this final stage, inequality has reached its peak with the establishment of despotism, where individuals lose all significance and autonomy, becoming equal only in their subjugation and insignificance under a tyrannical ruler. In this way, society returns to a kind of equality, but it is a negative equality in which all are equally powerless and subjected to the will of the despot. This closing of the circle from freedom to oppression marks the full evolution of inequality from its natural beginnings to its extreme corruption. Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men by Jean-Jacques Rousseau ultimately portrays the tragic transformation of humanity as a result of social evolution, where the development of property, societal structures, and competition led to increasing inequality, corruption, and a loss of freedom. Rousseau's exploration highlights how human progress, driven by self-interest and desire for status, created unnatural hierarchies and divisions that continue to shape modern societies. Through his critique, Rousseau invites readers to consider the possibility of reclaiming more authentic human values and envisioning a society that truly serves the collective well-being.
Curious to dive into the mind of Jean-Jacques Rousseau? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of discourse on the origin and basis of inequality among men in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.